Good morning, Covenant College. I am going to make every good effort this morning to avoid saying anything too terribly compelling, because it's recently been brought to my attention that occasionally, when I'm standing at this lectern and making what might be construed as comments that would be compelling, I evidently have a tendency to wiggle just a little bit. And I now recognize that doing so might be kind of distracting to at least some of you out there. So I'm being very careful not to say anything too compelling. The challenge of not being compelling is going to be especially difficult this morning because it's my distinct honor to introduce someone who is terribly compelling, Professor Jeffrey Morton of the Covenant College Art Department. The writer James Baldwin once wrote, "The role of the artist is exactly the same as the role of the lover." There's more, but I guess maybe that's enough. It says, "The role of the artist is exactly the same as the role of the lover. If I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you don't see." There's a lot that we, the community of Covenant College, see well and faithfully, but it's also true that we possess a great many profound and troubling blind spots. We desperately need the artists among us to help us to become more conscious of what we don't or aren't willing to see right in front of our eyes, whether it's dimensions of the world's injustices and suffering, small-mindedness and cruelty within the Christian subculture, or features of our very own hypocrisy and narcissism. Professor Jeff Morton is among a group of faithful artists we're privileged to have among us that's committed to helping us to see. Today's speaker is a creative teacher, an endlessly encouraging colleague, a dependable friend with a listening ear, an art coach, a caring mentor, a stunning interpreter of modern and contemporary art, and a brilliant artist in his own right. He's also a loving husband and a father of four, a pillar of his church community, and a tireless liaison between our college and the broader community. He's here to bring us the latest installment of our Faculty Chapel series, This I Believe. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jeffrey Morton.
I'm going to grab one of these things here, because I don't need the authoritarian power of the lectern. And I need to foreground some images, and we'll get that started. Jay, we are narcissistic, aren't we? Right? It's so easy. Look, this would be a lot of fun if we could spend the rest of the time sort of making fun of each other. But we're not going to do that. Let me see. Let me get my slides. Well, thank you for hanging out with me. A couple weeks ago, you'll remember Dr. Green talked about the stuff that we take camping. Yeah, he's correct. We take way too much stuff. And while Jay and I bring most of the gear along with firewood, we all bring, including Capic, our other stuff, our personal issues and burdens to the campfire. While it would not be appropriate, or better yet, not very comfortable to talk about our other stuff in this setting, let me assure you, we're no different from you. We're just a bit older and perhaps, presumably, a bit wiser. There's so much more to talk about and say about this give and take between the three of us, but I should tell you this. Because of Capic, I'm a reluctant theologian. Like many of you, my calling at Covenant is to take seriously my philosophy and theology as it shapes my thinking and making. One of our projects at Covenant, as far as I know, is to ask us to, quote, engage culture. But what does that look like? Is it through analysis, participation, or better yet, submission? But thanks to Green and a few others, Whitebrook, Morris, Tate, Davis, Stevens, and others, I'm also an unintentional philosopher. More importantly, like Green, I too am a Christian materialist. And when we're not talking about our families, football, or ourselves, Caput Green and I do find a space to consider how deeply our faith intersects our differences. Because of these guys, I have the social capital to talk with you today. Artists really want to make art. And when we talk about art in public, we want to talk about our art. Most importantly, that's what we want to do. I want to talk about my show at the Hunter last year. Call me narcissistic, but I'm going to talk about me today. What follows are some stories from my art viewing history, my mental catalog, or as my colleague Dr. Whitebrook would call, the archive. The archive is filled with images of our past, whether they're loved or forgotten, pleasant or really present. We all have an image bank. So here's a story. In my drawing class, each fall, and in preparation for a self-portrait image, I asked my student the question, what makes us human? Here you're looking at Greg Van Dyke and Carrie Morton. These are self-portraits that they did in my class. So I asked them, all right, what makes us human? This year the conversation was lively, and to be honest, I was not prepared for their responses. I should have been. I thought we'd talk about our psychology or our sociology, our sexuality, our economics, or even our politics. Better yet, I thought we would discuss the tension between our materiality and spirituality. But no, they, my students, wanted to talk about language. Some smart person, undoubtedly sharing her knowledge gained from Dr. Stevens, talked about how language separates us from animals, while I wanted to talk about how the marks we make on a page are our personal signatures. My students wanted to talk about personal language. Finally, I shut them out, asking them why we have color. Sure, God gave us an unlimited palette, I affirm, but I argue that we have color because language cannot consume it. Think about it. We can't name all the color in the world. We can't even describe it. Artist and theoretician David Batchelor suggests this. He says, to attend to color, then, is in part to attend to the limits of language. It is to try to imagine, often through the medium of language, he understands the irony, what a world without language might be like. Now listen, I'm not here to pick a fight with my friends who use words more than they use color, but I want to encourage us. When we run out of words, we'll be okay. It will be all right. This is an image. It's called 2,304 square inches of silence. I made it a few years ago. Art allows us to hesitate before speaking. Art gives us permission to be quiet. It was Wittgenstein who saw in color the outer limits of language when he said, quote, whereof we cannot speak, therefore we must remain silent. Batchelor suggests silence is spoken by the body through our gestures and our postures. It is through the body we express ourselves when we run out of words. Admit it. Not many of us want to see our bodies for what they are. Maybe this is why silence is so awkward. It's just we don't want to live with our bodies. However, it's not just our artists who are asking these weird questions. It's not just the artists who are asking us to consider the body as a location of human inquiry. Florida Atlantic University philosophy professor who directs the Center for the Body, Mind, and Culture suggests this. Because the body is an essential and valuable dimension of humanity, it should be recognized as a crucial topic of humanistic study and experiential learning. I'm not sure how this works for the philosophers, historians, or theologians among us, but I do see connections between our bodies and the arts. This is what I believe. Ultimately, I believe we have color, and specifically, for today's discussion, why I believe gray matters. It's because we have to enter into God's world, create relationships, care for others, and to be cared for too. I'll get more at that later. The word gray is problematic in many ways. When it lands on our ears, we think of uncertainty. We think of the gray areas in an argument. Or, in the social sphere of politics or in sport, we might be surprised to find our ethics shift. Even when we look at the word gray, it can't make up its mind. Do we spell it with an A or with the letter E? I guess if you're on the other side of the pond, you use the latter. Well, in my life, the color gray has psychological implications. I'm a middle child. I needed flexibility to navigate the space between highly competitive siblings. Just ask my cousin. My coping mechanism, as the shortest of my two older brothers and my younger brother, and I'm going to go here, my younger brother was taller than me, and so he called me his little brother. But I grew up. I got over it. So I did things that they didn't. I was a wrestler and not a basketball or baseball player. I became an artist and not a financial investor, business owner, or flight surgeon doctor. They're not as cool. I would go to the Philadelphia Museum with my maternal grandfather, from whom I get my round head. He was so cute. I'll tell you more about him later. We looked at paintings. We looked at paintings like Van Gogh and others, and all I had to do was I had to keep him from touching the paintings. He was a tactile person. He was a sculptor. He was a wood carver, and he's the owner of this, which is a mallet. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit later. So I'm going to just put this here. Talk about that a little bit later. He would go over and touch the Chagall's, and I'm like smacking his hands. Love it. He preferred the Rodin Museum, which is just at the foot of the steps that Rocky made famous, running up this hill. Of course, I preferred the Philadelphia Museum, and particularly the modern and contemporary wing. Later in life, did I realize why he recoiled at the art that I loved. Modernistisch, he would say, when he looked at Van Gogh, Kirchner, and Klee. And when he looked at their influence in my art, he must have felt betrayed. In the early 20th century, these modern artists and their emerging style took away his livelihood as a woodcarver in the Rhineland in Germany, where he was born. I think we found common ground a few years before he died when he saw in my work a brush that carved with paint, rather than a chisel that carved wood. "Oh, you are one of us," he said. I'm still deconstructing that statement now 20 years ago. What does he mean? On to Van Gogh. This is simply called Rain. It was done a year before he died. While he was a patient in the hospital in St. Paul in St. Remy, my French isn't very good. In the small town near Arles, he entered a facility in May of 1889 in search for help for his emotional problems. He had a private room as well as a studio. And from this room, Van Gogh could look down on the wheat field depicted in Rain. During his 11-month stay, Van Gogh drew and painted this view a dozen times, editing out the bars on the windows each time. You just think about that act of taking the bars away from the table, from his view. It should be no surprise that Van Gogh suggests in nature, and I'm quoting him here because he has this amazing collection of letters that he has given to his brother. And you can find him in a book called Dear Theo. Really delightful relationship between the two of them. But Van Gogh says this: absolute black does not really occur in nature. The Dutch artist states in a letter to his brother that the artist sees only a variety of grays distinguished in tone and intensity. Van Gogh advocates for a painter to study and analyze the environment and then make grays of nature on the palette. I think you can see in this painting, which is in the Philadelphia Museum, it's a gray painting, much like our landscape today, but without the raindrops. Gray is the color of wisdom, suggests Wittgenstein. Life and religion are full of color. In 1939, we could only wonder how film viewers would have responded to seeing color on the big screen for the first time. Remember, at exactly 16 minutes and 50 seconds into the film, directed by Victor Fleming, the grand splendor of color obliterates the monochrome memory of Dorothy's Kansas. Now, I'm not showing you Munching Land. Here, obviously, the foursome is off to the Emerald City. But imagine this, that your film viewing experience is full of gray. Suddenly, it explodes with color. I don't know what Wittgenstein would have thought about the movie, but at least for me, it's a story about doubt and belief, where gray and color meet. As an artist, color functions this way for me. Let me explain. 20th century Bauhaus teacher and former Yale professor Joseph Albers suggests, quote, "In visual perception, a color is never seen as it really is, as it physically is. This makes color the most relative medium in art." In my many color studies with people whom Albers taught, two of these stand out. This is a piece from his Interaction in Color series. We could do this. I do this. I have a stack of paper. I meant to bring them. But the color squares in the middle are the exact same color. But because they have different contexts, they have different pronouncements. And I think that's kind of what I'm arguing. Color needs context. Gray needs context to live and to thrive. So his first approach was that the study of color was basically to do first and theorize later. He talks about teaching color systems as, quote, teaching the cooking of color. Cooking requires tasting. And like cooking, the painter will need to discipline her practice to the act of testing color combinations. I prefer cooking over baking. Now, this is a blanket statement. I know it's not nuanced. Baking, you follow the rules, right? You know, if you do the rules wrong, the pie doesn't work out. Cooking requires participation, tasting along the way, wondering if the gravy is rich enough or not. Well, Albers asked this question. He says, what color is able to play such a complementary role in what's shown? In other words, how can we do this? Well, the answer to his question lies in the context of the field of color and in the kind of color acting in that field. Most often, that color is neutral. And in our study, we're going to talk about gray. 20th century phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty suggests that the question regarding color is not the simulacrum, the representation of an unsatisfactory imitation of nature, but rather the question regarding color is its dimensional possibility, or what he calls, quote, a materiality, a something. I can think of no other artist in my visual archive that turns a color into a something than the French artist Pierre Bonnard. Bonnard ruined me. I wanted to be a designer and not a painter. I wanted to make a living and have a stable life. Like my mentor, Bob Reed, when we viewed a painting by Bonnard, all we could do was retreat to the studio to paint. That's what artists do. When they see other artists, they just want to go make. The point of art is about hard looking and recognizing things are not as they appear. We look out of the corner of our eye rather than directly at a subject, or when we try to discern the space between light and shadow, we're disoriented. Over time, we disentangle what we see. I first saw this painting over 30 years ago at the Met. Have you seen the figure on the right yet? Bonnard did this. He was wacky. He would create things that you wouldn't expect to see. New York Times writer Michael Kimmelman suggests about this painting, The Breakfast Table of 1936, is a good example of Bonnard's optical illusions. Like other Bonnards, it looked flat at first, as if all the forms were flowers, everything pressed beneath the book. But when we look further, we gradually see the landscape in the window, that's in the middle of the picture, a teapot on the table, the edge of a chair, the open door beside a radiator, and Martha, that's his wife, in the far right corner, inspecting a teacup with the same curiosity that we have of the whole image. Bonnard gets us inside the painting. Only after a moment do we notice there's another figure in the picture in the mirror reflected behind, and presumably that's the artist. Kimmelman says, I think the source of Bonnard's intimacy is not that he painted cozy interiors, but that he inhabited his pictures in this way. He once told a model that he wanted her not to sit still, but to move around the room while he painted. He wanted both presence and absence. Put differently, he tried to convey his presence to imply the interaction between him and his subject. Here's another good example. In many works, we have a strong feeling that we are in the space of the represented image, suggests Graham Nicholson. The nearness is a very strong element in the work. In Young Woman in a Garden, we're looking down at Renee. She's in the center of the picture. And upon being introduced to her at the garden table, we experience the thrill of perhaps a significant encounter. Bonnard, however, does something even more curious. He places us in the middle of the painting and in the middle of the conversation, because on the far right is another fragment of Martha, his wife. So he places us in this psychological and awkward space as well. You know, that whole difficulty of trying to leave a conversation and when the person still talks. That's what Bonnard does. He captures you. He won't let you go. You know those annoying people. Hopefully I'm not one of them. As a conversationalist, but as a painter, I want to do that too. That's my aim. I want to catch you inside my work. I want you to experience the world through my art. I want you to have to peel it back as if it were an onion. Bonnard had a notable critic, Picasso. While viewing a portrait by Bonnard, and presumably it was this one, the photographer Cartier-Bresson said, you know, Picasso didn't like Bonnard, and I can imagine why. Because Picasso had no tenderness. It's only a very flat explanation to say that Bonnard is looking in a mirror in this painting. He's looking far beyond. To me, and this is Bresson saying, he's the greatest painter of the century. Picasso was a genius, but that's something quite different. Don't talk to me about Bonnard, said Picasso. That's not painting, what he does. Painting isn't a question of sensibility. It's a question of seizing power, taking it over from nature, not expecting her to supply you with information and good advice. Picasso wasn't a very nice person. I like this one. Picasso's critique on Bonnard is one about his aesthetic choices and his composition. Composition is the way an artist takes your hand and leads you through the painting, much like a child will lead you to her favorite treat in the candy store. That's what composition is. Picasso plays off Bonnard's doubt. He questions, how could a wall be two colors at the same time? As for his indecision, it was well known that Bonnard would return to his paintings and retouch them years later, even after they were sold. I mean, it's true. I don't know. The best Bonnard could be for Picasso was an impressionist. As a painter, though, I identify with Bonnard's doubt. I wonder if my colors are the right ones. I wonder if my marks are the best. And why, oh why, when I make a painting, do I lament over the layer I just covered up? So here's an example of one of my paintings. It's called Skin Burn. It's a painting about kudzu. The form of kudzu is a really intriguing subject. It's about 3 feet square. An encounter of walking through this strange landscape really intrigues me more. Actually, the experience is quite scary. To gather sources for my art, I trip over vines that literally grab at my arms and my legs, making my task impossible. And in this painting, it's a painting about the color of my skin as it gets burnt by sitting in the landscape. So sure, it's a painting about circles and dots and marks and scribbles, I suppose. But it's a painting about my experience in the landscape. So when I go to the landscape, I sit back, I make small drawings, and I can only stay for about 4 hours at a time. So here's one, here's another. Thus, a title of a 2-day drawing reads something like 7 hours and 36 minutes, or in this case, 7 hours and 42 minutes. Seeing those digits and considering my exposure, because there are all kinds of bugs in there, and I convince myself when I go into a kudzu field there are no snakes. And whether that's true or not, I don't know. Don't tell me if you know otherwise. So it's not just the snag of this invasive pest, the kudzu painting, the ticks, the mites, and mosquitoes that eat up my body and my psychology as well. My artistic practice is not only an endurance test of drawing and mark making, it's a practice of how much time I can actually spend in this beautiful yet annoying landscape. Now, part of my practice is I take these drawings home and I make paintings of them in my studio. In front of you is an image called Membrane Wall. These paintings from my kudzu series have asked me once again to consider my displacement, why I live in Southeast Tennessee, and how those works mean to me, or what they mean to me. What I'm trying to argue here is I'm trying to make a connection between art and life, and not separate the two. Martin Heidegger asked a very important question regarding my question about art and life. He says this: is art an essential and necessary manner in which truth happens? Or is art no longer this? Art, for the German philosopher, is a living and is a living and nourishing activity of how we humans, quote, bring forth into the world. Rather than an ancient ideal form, in his mind, art is an organic and active extension of human life. To this end, he feared art to be at risk. He worried that in his technological age, circa 1950, that art would no longer be viewed as essential, necessary, or even possible. His critique is worth considering today. Here's another image. This is called Vine Language. And I want to talk about it in the context of, one of the ways I think about this is those images of dot matrices on your computer, or just sort of imagining the digital sphere of zeros and ones just sort of floating around in space. Listen, I'm not the computer science guy, but I know that there's this strange digital world and there's a lot of odd things happening. Dennis Schmidt is afraid that what will remain for us today is only one form of production. Schmidt, too, is commenting on our technological age. He says email is the problem. He says, in our age of narcissistic tweets and self-obsessed blogs, Schmidt grieves letter writing is lost. Well, while each generation laments loss and views the next generation as too liberal or overly progressive, or from the other side of the critique, that the preceding generation is viewed as overly nostalgic or conservative, we need to consider the connection between the space of technology and our art. No longer using images as idioms of truth, Heidegger's fear is that art and images will be used primarily as a means of manipulation, and ultimately, this degeneration of images will close off the movement of life. I can think of no other good example for this than the internet meme. It's highly problematic. I must admit they're humorous and witty, but it does so at the expense of others. It's merely a game for pastiche and mockery. How does it add to life, I wonder? Does it add to this movement of life? Art making is world making. Or to put it another way, art making is meaning-minding. In short, art helps us make sense of the world. Heidegger believed that art is a question of being. Moreover, the way I see it is I make art because it's important to life, and I suppose you writers, poets, vocalists, musicians, and web developers think the same thing. You make art because it's important. So let me conclude a little bit. Let me try and wrap this up. Connecting the dots between my painting and this mallet, and why gray matters. And maybe something for you to do. When I think of the many modern artworks that my grandfather recoiled from, I think of this piece by Paul Klee. It's done in 1923. It's a beautiful piece about color. There's a wonderful progression. Either if you're from the inside, the colors are much more bright and much more intense, and as you get to the outside, they're much more dull or neutral or gray. So let me tell you about my grandfather. At a memorial service 18 years ago, I told stories about his hand and his mallet. At that time, I didn't have his mallet. My grandfather loved birds and animals of nature. He made many people happy by making these carvings. He was proud of his work and his hands he used to make these pieces. He would grab one of his carvings and he'd go, naturalistisch, he'd say, pointing to his exquisite naturalism. But he was also a thankful man, and he was eager to share his joy of life with others. One year, when I was in art school, he came to our campus and took a sculpture studio with some of my classmates. They loved him, and I was proud to call him mine. Imagine your grandfather coming to study with you at Covenant College. He told me, I left my country because there was no work for me. In 1929, however, there was work for a woodcarver in the United States. He remained in the Woodworkers Union until the 1933 Great Depression. When he received his first week's wage, he took this mallet apart, he drilled a hole in it, made a hollow chamber, put a nickel inside, and glued it back together. And when he shook the mallet, for him, it represented a thankful heart, that he found a place in the United States where, through God's help, that he could go about his work. I think I want to suggest this, because my grandfather used art in a doxological manner, and we use art to praise Jesus, and that's a good thing. But I'd like to suggest that there are two other ways that we use art to help us pray. I'm going to focus on one more than the other. Besides being doxological or being thankful, I think art can help us confess. I think this is when I allow art to allow me to participate in the gray areas of life that I enter in. But I also want to talk to you perhaps more about this other idea, that art helps me petition before God. Life is broken. We need help. In this painting is called Oxygen. I use the repetitive act of mark making, dot pointing, to think of my friends, including my friend Graham, who was diagnosed with cancer this year. This painting allows, no longer do I try and exclude all the noises of life into the studio. I bring those noises in. My friend Mark, who's an oncologist, tells me this painting looks like blood cells through a microscope. I like his reading of it. And I think what I told my friend Mark is art allows me to connect with life rather than retreat from it. And so I want to suggest this. We have the color gray, because with gray we have to enter in. We have to find the context. Gray allows us to enter in even if it hurts. Color requires silence. But even more so, color requires participation. That's what I believe. Let me close in prayer here just a minute. We thank you, Lord Jesus, for giving us this time that we might worship you and think about you. Lord, I thank you for the gray areas in our life. Help us to participate with our neighbor, learn to love and to be loved by others. It's in this we pray. Amen.
Amen.